And for our next talk, Jim Cowie from Dyn is going to be speaking on issues in the IPv4 transfer market.
I'm Jim Cowie. I'm the chief scientist at Dyn. For a long time, people have been saying, why don't you come speak at RIPE? And I've spoken quite a lot at NANOG. I've certainly spoken at the RIPE regional meetings like ENOG and MENOG. But it's true, until today, I'd never actually come to RIPE. So thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I always used to say, well, I'm waiting for the right topic. We have to find a topic that will really be on target for the RIPE audience. And we did find one here. Of course, the IPv4 exhaustion situation, the development of the transfer market for IPv4 space, led us to wonder whether we could find any evidence that transfers of IPv4 space were being handled particularly well or particularly badly when they finally hit the routing table. Wouldn't that be an interesting thing to look at? And this is sort of an extension of the things that we did at Renesys and which we're now doing at Dyn, looking into the routing data over a long period of time and looking at these transition moments to find out how the parties involved are actually coordinating the transfer of this space. So as background, of course, I think I'm not a numbering policy specialist, and I think you're going to have a lot of good discussion later this week about the issues behind IPv4 transfer. But what everybody knows, I think, is that the pace is really picking up, right? Because we have reached exhaustion, because there are basically no more v4 addresses to give out, transfer has started. So here's a graph of the number of blocks that are being transferred each month just within the RIPE region, just in PA space. All right, so that's obviously a very limited subset of all the transfers that are taking place. There's legacy transfers that are probably dwarfing this, but this is a nice subset. One, because they're published, and two, because we can then dig in and find out what happened to these blocks. So it's cool. This is a real market, and markets are a great way to allocate scarce resources to people who need them the most. So we also note that these are still early days. If you look at this graph, which is subtly different, this is the total number of unique addresses, right, which is different from the number of blocks. The block transfer rate goes up pretty smoothly. The count of addresses transferred is up and down, at least in PA space, because there are some very large blocks that are moving. And you can think of these, I guess, the large blocks being transferred as being like old-growth forest. Right? People have moved to the new world. They've started cutting down the forest in enormous chunks. And these are, some of the old-growth trees that you're never going to see again. And I think the fate here, ultimately, is going to be that we start transferring smaller and smaller blocks. And if we believe, the story, the routing table is going to fill up with tiny blocks. Today, though, we're still in this initial regime. So where are all the transfers coming from? This was sort of our first question. And this was really shocking when Doug Midori and I dug into this. Usually when you graph the size of the internet in a particular country, it has this nice up and to the right graph that is true across basically all countries. Every country has an internet economy that grows. Every country allocates and puts into service new v4 space until this year. And last summer, as you can see Romania beginning to sell off its v4 assets, we actually see about 3,000, I believe. There's a huge decline, basically, in the amount of Romanian address space that's actually out there in the v4 routing table. That's reasonably stunning, right? Half of the PA space blocks transferred since January 2014 are coming from one country due to the efforts of a couple of individuals and their companies. 44% of those blocks are from jump.ro, who are disassembling Romanian address space and packaging it up and sending it overseas. So where's it going? So again, this is kind of neat. The address space is ending up in the Middle East. To the extent that today, out of about 4,500 prefixes in the global v4 table for Saudi Arabia, roughly 1/3 of those prefixes were in Romania last year. Okay, it's a wholesale shipment of content to Saudi Arabia. And a lot of those are being advertised as /24s. So, you know, if you add it up, perhaps it's a little different. But the trend is clear here that I was in Riyadh last week at the V6 forum, and this was very much on their mind. The fact that IPv6 not having quite taken off yet, there is some interim space allocation that has to be purchased in order to keep the Saudi Arabian economy growing and thriving. And of course, nobody talks about how much money is being spent, but at around $10 an IP, you know, it's probably $15 million that they've spent to get this space up and reallocated to Saudi Arabian companies. It's not just the Saudis, of course. Iran and Syria and the UAE are all taking space as well from Romania. So we wanted to find out what would happen. So you know that we talk a lot about BGP hijacking. We talk about all of the terrible accidents that can happen when you reuse address space in two different places at once. How many of you watch Top Gear? Probably, oh yeah. So you know that the Dacia is a fantastic car. The Romanian car is, and if you export the Dacia, it has this nice property that if I sell you a Dacia and you take it to another country and drive it, I cannot also drive it in my own country. I give you the title, I hand over the keys. From that moment on, you can be pretty sure that you're the only person driving your car. And unfortunately, IPv4 addresses are not like that. So the person who sells it can keep driving it simultaneously in a different part of the world. They can do anything they want with it. They can get traffic tickets. They can commit vehicular homicide. And it's your car, right? Pretty complex. So we wanted to see, here's just an example. There are many, many of these. And when we went digging through the PA transfer table, we just wanted to find a couple really egregious examples of things that could go wrong at handover. Here's one from late October of last year. So we're transferring a /17 out of Romania, and we're giving it to the mobile communication company of Iran, the primary mobile phone carrier. And over here on the right, you can see a nice graph of the prefix coming up. The y-axis is percentage of the DYNE peers that see this relationship in the table. And so before the transfer, the 17 was not being used. At transfer, it becomes 100% visible. And originated by this nice 32-bit AS belonging to the mobile communication company. All right, great, good sale. Hand over the keys, drive it around a little bit. Oh, but then nothing is ever that simple. So level 3 had been announcing some more specifics of that /17 since 2012 due to a relationship with the seller. Okay, so here we have a set of /21s, more specifics within the /17. Okay, what happens when you have more specifics in the table that you don't control? Well, that becomes little embedded black holes in the 17. And of course, we don't talk to the Iranian mobile provider, so we don't know what's going on, what's their customer experience, but we can guess. Okay, because any traffic that's on net with level 3, which is going to be a good chunk of the entire planet, is not going to be able to deliver traffic to Iran in the /17. Well, they will across the 17, but not in these particular /21s. And you don't know why this is happening. And I'm sure that there was some consternation inside Iran because they may have figured, well, we seem to be getting blocked from certain services. We seem not to be able to deliver traffic on this new network that we acquired. Maybe it's the embargo, who knows? It turns out, of course, it's not the embargo, it's simply BGP routing at work. So The Iranian mobile provider are clever guys, and they figure out eventually by looking at the routing table what the case is here. And so they start advertising still more specifics. And you can see here on the right that the /22, more specific than one of these /21s, pops into existence towards the ends of December. Okay? So they purchased something, they started using it, they noticed impairment, and then it takes almost 3 months for them to get more specifics into the table. They're unable to communicate effectively with the advertisers of the less specifics to make them stop. And so they simply have to turn around and re-inject more specifics to try to get control back. This is really an untenable, situation. You have to wonder, I guess, what we're going to do in terms of standard escrow agreements. Then when we transfer blocks, the seller presumably has a responsibility to make sure that that block is not routed, that there are not unrelated, more specifics still floating around in the table. This is something that perhaps people are going to ask for in standard terms and conditions if they don't already get it. Oh, and that's not as bad as it gets. So another company in Romania has been advertising one of these /22s since 10 November, okay? And then the Iranians have to come back and announce more and more specifics. So now they're down to /23s. Because that's the only tool you have, right, is to try to be more specific, to try to get the traffic back. And where this bottoms out, as you can guess, is in /24. You can see one on the right here. This /24 is being announced simultaneously in Romania and in Iran. And because you can't plausibly go longer than /24 and still get it globally routed, this is the stalemate we end up in. So half the world thinks this /24 is in Iran. The other half thinks it's in Romania. This is just not a tenable state of affairs. Also, if any of you try to do tools based on geolocation, stuff like this turns out to confuse geolocation services woefully. Okay? Here, just to pick, I'm not picking on GeoIP2, but here's one of these blocks, which is thought to be in Romania. Its location is Romania. Oh, but the ISP that publishes it is the Mobile Communication Company of Iran. So inconsistencies like this pop up as these transfer procedures continue. Other things happen, and I think one of the key things here is BGP hijacking. We've talked about for a long time. We've talked about methods to prevent it. We've talked about methods to avoid it. IPv4 transfers are going to be one of probably the largest contributors to the pool of hijacking behaviors that you're going to see in the wild, just because it's pretty likely, right? One company has been advertising this space for a long time. They've been using it for various functions. They're offering services at particular IPs in those blocks. And then they have to stop. And stopping doing something completely can be more difficult. The probability that there's going to be some sort of an accidental collision is much higher, I think, in the transfer scenario than in an unrelated hijacking scenario. So here's an example where somebody from here, A2B Internet, had transferred a block and at some point then accidentally re-advertised it, which you can happen. You can imagine an old config getting imported. You can imagine something coming back, so that for a number of hours there was a hijack of the space by the seller, attracting about 10% of the world's peers, of our peers. 90% still like the route published by the buyer, but 10% is a fairly substantial impairment. It gets even worse. There's a case here where the more specific was in the Palestinian territories, and the man-in-the-middle routing, a man-in-the-middle route hijack scenario evolved, where the traffic was in fact being brought back to the seller's home, and then they realized that, wait, that's not our prefix, let's send it back on its way, so the traffic went back to the Palestinian territories. Okay? So you have the buyer, in this case, through a complete accident, acting transiently as a man-in-the-middle traffic interceptor, potentially, for traces in traffic that are flowing to the buyer's prefix. I'm going to probably wrap this up because I think you get the picture. I think that it's interesting that so much can be summed up in buyer beware. And I think that the fact that we now have commercial relationships with contracts between buyers and sellers actually gives us a very interesting new place to stand when it comes time to think about how to reduce the likelihood that IPv4 blocks will be hijacked. The buyer, though, needs to exercise the due diligence. Take a look at the historical routing. So you need to go back in time, potentially for years, and find out all the ways in which the sellers have used this prefix and any more specifics that they may have handed out to other people to advertise, and make sure that all of those come out of the table, that all of those are completely quiet before you take possession and have quiet enjoyment of your new address space. It's important to think about DNS, perhaps. People have had important domain names pointed at your space for a long time, and some of those may still be out there, and you're going to get the traffic for them if they're still in effect. I think routing alarms are definitely to be called for. It doesn't matter who you get them from or if you roll it yourself. But you need to find out reasonably quickly whenever even a small percentage of the world has decided that it likes a different route to your prefixes. Because if it is a purchased prefix, the odds are it's going to have some involvement with where the prefix came from. You can't, I think you can't overemphasize the importance of participating in communities like RIPE and having technical relationships with the people from the seller's organization. I know that a lot of the time we talk about blocks being traded off at arm's length or almost anonymously. I think that in this case, being able to call up the people who have been routing this space is going to be really a pretty critical protection to get these loops closed faster than otherwise. And frankly, I'm going to be interested to see how these sorts of issues affect the contractual legalities of closing. Terms and conditions for sale or transfer of IP space are obviously going to need assertions about clean routability at transfer time. But because we see that these problems go on in an unrelated way for months or years, it may actually be necessary to start thinking about things like clawbacks. After all, you have a continuing commercial relationship with the transferor. It may be possible to utilize that as an incentive for them to make sure that they implement good hygiene and don't accidentally put your purchased prefix back into the table in an inappropriate way, or allow any of their customers to do the same. All right, I'm going to wrap up there and take some questions, but again, I thank you very much for inviting me to write.
So, questions? Miriam?
Just a data point for me.
Sorry, can you just say?
Yes, sorry, I was be about to say that. I'm Miriam Kühne from the RIPE NCC. Just some additional data. Some of my colleagues at the RIPE NCC, for those of you who missed that, have published a more in-depth article on IPv4 transfers just recently on RIPE Labs. And labs.ripe.net is on the homepage there. So if you're interested in some more details, not about the routing part of it, but about the transfer part, then please have a look there.
Cool.
Okay, let's go one to the other. So, Leslie, you going to start?
Hi, Leslie Carr, Cumulus Networks. Do you know if any of the people who've had their routing space not hijacked, but badly sold, have had any luck talking with the upstreams of the people illegitimately advertising their space?
I don't know. That would seem to be a good way to go if you can't talk to the seller. We know that at least in the Iranian case, it did not happen. So, anecdotally, I don't know.
Alain Durand, I can. You were mentioning at the beginning of your talk that at the moment this is just the beginning of this process, so a few extra routes, a few /22s or /24s, it's not a huge deal.
Right.
But at some point it will become a huge deal. So do you have any prediction or when this could become a problem, and what kind of measurement can we make to actually monitor this and know ahead of time when this is going to be a problem?
Right. So monitoring ahead of time that this is going to be a problem, again, it's mostly a matter of figuring out how the space has been historically routed. And I think the best case for us all will be the cases where this is truly old-growth forest being cut down, and it hasn't ever been routed. or it hasn't been routed in many, many years. I think that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that in some sense, the transfer of PA space within the RIPE region between RIPE folks should be a best case. The database here is in pretty good shape. You all talk to each other. We have RIPE meetings. If we can't get it right in this particular constrained case, I'm really worried about what happens when we start doing intercontinental transfers and we start dealing with people who are at much greater social distance from each other and who have databases that are not as well maintained and everything else. So this is the time to get this right while it's still just among us friends in RIPE PA space land.
Thank you.
Ilyich from Beinum. So maybe you are not the right person to answer, but or maybe you are. But what I wonder is, will our PKI be the solution to this? Because if deployed, it could just kill all the bad advertisements. But then, of course, it still has to be deployed everywhere.
Yep. I wish it could be deployed everywhere, and that would solve all of this, and it would also solve all the rest of the BGP hijacking problems, and that would be great.
Wilfried Weber, one of the old local registry manager heads, and for a network which has a large consistency using legacy address space. So I'm fully aware that you were not looking in particular at the legacy situations, but some of that stuff, I guess, is pretty similar to the situation in the PA space.
Yep.
And you were correctly pointing to the forward DNS. But a while ago, we put together a recommendation to our constituency not to transfer addresses because of a long list of things. Most of them you have laid out here in your presentation.
Yeah.
But I am missing one thing, and that's actually the question, whether you were looking at that topic or issue as well, and that's reverse DNS. In particular, if you try to transfer subsets of, for example, a /p, a /16, because in most cases the primary DNS, reverse DNS delegation is happening on the basis of the /16. So you either have to sell your soul in addition to the IP addresses and rely on the reverse DNS services of the original /16 holder, or you have to deaggregate the whole thing and potentially do the right thing. So I'm wondering whether you had some sort of look at that issue on top of your list.
I have not looked at that issue, but now I'm fascinated, so I will go back and look at that right away.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Elvis Velevi for Escrow. We've had a few chats about this also in Dubai at Mainog. It's an interesting research, and I would only like to add one more thing about it, and that is that we as a broker of IP addresses, we've tried as much as possible to do a due diligence and make sure that once the seller wants to sell, they stop the announcement before the buyer actually gets the address space. Yep. Now, we've encountered two problems with that. One of them being that once the seller stopped the announcement, someone did a hijack and started sending millions of spams from the address block because it was no longer announced by the legitimate holder, and the block got into spam house. And then, of course, it got chopped into two, so two parties had to talk to spam house about it, and blah, 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 blah. That was one of the things that I've noticed happening, and I've raised this concern with the RIPE community and with the anti-abuse working group at the previous RIPE meeting. It is one of the ways of cleanly doing these transfers is for the seller to stop, for the buyer to start after the transfer has been completed, but then we end up with having hijacks. Another pretty good option would be indeed of using certification, only, or not only, but primarily on the buyer side. Once they get the block in their portal, they can enable certification and then get alerts every single time someone announces any bits of that address space,
right,
at least use certification for the alerts, if not for the traffic management. However, in this market, I think, I don't know how to actually say it, but I think that the best way would be for, yeah, maybe the RIPE NCC to find a way to actually do the transition between the buyer and the seller. So the seller stops announcing, the RIPE NCC marks it somehow, I don't know, and then once it's completely transferred, then the seller gets to start announcing, sorry, the buyer gets to start announcing it from their own IS. And that might actually help with a lot of things, not just with the anti-hijack method. It might also help with getting the address space cleaned if it has been somehow dirtied by the previous users, right, and some other things. So I don't know if this would be even considered by the NCC, but I don't know. I know we've discussed this, and this might be an idea for all of these things.
Yeah, it's a good topic, I think, for later in the week. And clearly, coordination has to improve, right? It would be better if maybe even on the same day, we think by analogy to house closing, where you show up, you get the keys, and you are the owner of the house. To close that window of uncertainty where it's no longer routed by A, but it hasn't yet been routed by B. If we could get that down to some time window where the spammers will not notice that this is now vagrant space, 24 hours, I'm not sure that that RIPE is the right party to bring in to make that happen, because this has to scale all over the planet. I think that contractually it's nice that we have contracts now, and you can put things in to say, I get back money if this does not go smoothly. This is your responsibility. And when money is at stake in a commercial transaction, people tend to be very serious about getting it right and doing it in a timely way.
A broker could also do the transitioning part, the part in between.
Yes.
But then the space will get blacklisted by Spamhaus because they will think it's hijacked.
You can't win.
Sam Weiler. What would you guess is the proportion of these incidents that is in some way or will in the future be attributable to malice rather than incompetence?
Oh, interesting. I think the bulk of all BGP hijackings worldwide, speaking broadly about any prefix that stomps on any other prefix, is incompetence, it's accident. There's a healthy percentage of those that are malicious. I think that when we, in sort of a Bayesian sense, when we already know that this space is a subject of transfer, I think the probability that it is accidental goes up. I think that the malicious hijacking of transferred space is probably lower than the malicious hijacking of arbitrary prefixes that get hijacked. But I'm not, I wouldn't put money on that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Cowie-Change for RIPE NCC. Thank you for the presentation. We just have another interesting data point. So you showed that game of announcing more specifics to get over the problem. And last year we did an experiment because ARIN has a policy to allocate 26s and 28s in cases they are needed. And we ran an experiment with ARIN. So we started announcing at 24. After 4 days, 92% of our RIS peers globally were able to see them. 25, it was about 20% of the global peers. And when it came to 28, it was only 15% of the global peers were able to see that. So that game of announcing more specifics will end at 24, basically, because after 24, whatever you announce, in most cases, is not seen. And these figures were all with route objects created in RIPE database. We also did it without route objects, and it's basically about 6% less. So.
Got it. Good. It's a good observation. I've suspected for a long time that the /24 limit, which is just culturally constructed among us, is going to soften as we get into exhaustion deeper and deeper, and people start carving things up smaller and smaller. So that's excellent data. I think that tail will grow, and eventually people will say, well, if I can get 18% propagation in the markets I care about, I'll do that. But we'll have to see.
Hi, Janugo Prins, better be here in the Netherlands. I see some numbers coming up in millions of dollars for transactions, etc. Do you have any idea when the amount of money being transferred is getting above a reasonable amount of money to get IPv6 up and running? Because that would be well.
Yeah, there are two cost curves here intersecting somewhere, but where do they intersect?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm not smart enough to say where that intersection is, but the market will tell us. And so in 2011, Microsoft pays $7.5 million for the Nortel space. Now we see, nations broadly paying tens of millions of dollars to get space. I don't know where that ends, but I know that people would prefer not to spend that money. The fact that they are, in fact, spending that money means one of two things. Either they are broadly irrational, or, which is possible, right?
Sure.
Or they're correct, and that's a decent investment in space, which is getting tighter and tighter. The fact that in 2011, Nortel space got sold was a huge wake-up call to CFOs all over the world that, hey, you have an intangible asset on your books that has a monetary value you can no longer ignore. It's
Sure.
time to value it. And we can't put that back in the bottle.
Pity.
Okay, I think it's lots of questions. So
That's good.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Thanks.
So our last speaker in this session, and all of Jim's questions have brought us nicely back up to time, so you're not getting an early coffee. So